On a bitter December morning in downtown Seattle, steam rose from the sidewalk grates as early commuters hurried past, clutching their coffee cups and avoiding eye contact with the woman huddled in a doorway. At 43, Rose had called these streets home for the past 8 months. Despite her circumstances, she maintained a quiet dignity, keeping herself as clean as possible using the public library's restroom and carefully protecting her few possessions in a weathered backpack. That morning started like any other, with Rose gathering her belongings and heading to her usual spot near the financial district. She'd found that this location, while not ideal for receiving spare change, offered better shelter from the wind that whipped between the towering glass buildings. What she didn't know was that this ordinary Tuesday would change not only her life but someone else's too. Around 9:30 a.m., she noticed something unusual. A well-dressed businessman was walking erratically, stumbling slightly. While most people might have assumed he was intoxicated, Rose recognized the signs immediately. She'd seen her late father experience the same symptoms before his diabetes diagnosis. The man's face was pale and sweaty despite the cold, and his movements became increasingly unsteady. Without hesitation, Rose approached him. "Sir, are you all right? You don't look well." The man tried to wave her off, but his hand trembled visibly. Rose persisted, "I think your blood sugar might be low. When's the last time you ate?" The man, who would later introduce himself as Mr. Chen, barely managed to mumble, "Meeting, important," before his knees buckled. Rose caught him before he hit the ground, her quick action preventing what could have been a serious head injury. She quickly reached into her backpack and pulled out her most precious possession, a granola bar she'd been saving for an emergency. Several bystanders had stopped to stare, but none approached to help. Rose carefully helped Mr. Chen sit against a wall and unwrapped the granola bar. "Please eat this, sir. It will help." Her voice was firm but gentle, the same tone she'd used years ago when teaching kindergarten, before a series of unfortunate events had left her homeless. As Mr. Chen slowly ate the granola bar, color began returning to his face. Rose stayed with him, talking softly about nothing in particular, keeping him calm and conscious. She shared how she recognized the symptoms from her father's experiences, explaining how regular meals were crucial for managing diabetes. What Rose didn't know was that Mr. Chen was not just another businessman. He was the CEO of a major tech company, heading to a crucial board meeting when his blood sugar had crashed. As his awareness returned, he looked at Rose with newfound clarity. Here was a homeless woman who had given him her only food without hesitation, potentially saving his life while better-dressed pedestrians had simply walked by. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice still slightly shaky. "Others just walked past." Rose's response was simple but profound, "Because you needed help. That's all anyone needs to know." She started to gather her things, ready to disappear back into the anonymity of the streets. But Mr. Chen wasn't going to let her leave so easily. As his driver, who had been frantically searching for him, finally arrived, he insisted on taking Rose to breakfast. Despite her initial reluctance, she was well aware of how she must look and smell. She eventually agreed, touched by his sincere gratitude. Over breakfast at a nearby diner, Rose's story gradually emerged. She had been a kindergarten teacher for 15 years before a perfect storm of misfortune struck. Her father's lengthy illness had drained her savings. Then, a school budget cut had left her unemployed. The final blow came when her apartment building was sold and converted to luxury condos, leaving her unable to find affordable housing on her substitute teacher's income. Mr. Chen listened intently, struck by how articulate and dignified Rose remained despite her circumstances. Here was someone who had dedicated her life to teaching children, who still had the presence of mind and compassion to help a stranger even when she had nothing herself. As they finished their meal, Mr. Chen made a decision that would change both their lives. "You helped me today without expecting anything in return," he said. "Now, please let me help you. Not as charity, but as an investment in someone who clearly has so much to offer society." What happened next seemed almost surreal to Rose. Mr. Chen's company had been developing an educational technology division, focused on creating software for early childhood education. They needed someone who understood both teaching and the real-world challenges that educators and students face. Would Rose be interested in joining their advisory board? Rose sat in stunned silence, her coffee growing cold in front of her. The offer wasn't just a job, it was a chance to combine her teaching experience with the opportunity to influence educational technology on a much larger scale. It was a path back not just to stability, but to making a real difference in children's lives again. This first part of their story ends with Rose accepting his offer, but with a condition of her own: any educational software they developed had to be accessible to schools in low-income areas at reduced or no cost. Mr. Chen readily agreed, recognizing that Rose's compassion and practical wisdom were exactly what his company needed. As she gathered her few belongings from the diner booth, Rose couldn't help but smile at the irony. She had given away her last granola bar and somehow ended up with a future she could never have imagined. But more importantly, she had stayed true to who she was, someone who would help others, regardless of her own circumstances. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would impact not just her life, but the lives of countless others. Her story would soon become a testament to the power of human kindness and the unexpected ways that helping others can transform lives. The transition from sleeping in doorways to working in a corporate office wasn't smooth or immediate. The day after their chance encounter, Mr. Chen arranged for Rose to stay at a comfortable hotel while more permanent arrangements could be made. That first night, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, almost afraid to move lest she discover it was all a dream. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes. A corporate apartment was secured, professional clothes were purchased, and medical and dental appointments were scheduled. But the most challenging adjustment wasn't physical, it was psychological. After months of being invisible to society, Rose now had to step into the spotlight. Her first day at Chen Technologies was particularly memorable. As she stood in the lobby, wearing a new navy blue suit that still felt foreign on her body, she could feel curious glances from employees who had clearly heard rumors about her unusual hiring. The whispers followed her, "That's her, the homeless woman Mr. Chen found." Some were skeptical, others curious, but Rose held her head high, remembering her mother's words, "Your circumstances don't define your worth." The company's educational technology division was housed on the 15th floor. Here, Rose found herself in a world of sleek monitors, whiteboard walls covered in flowcharts, and endless cups of premium coffee. But amid the modern surroundings, she noticed something concerning: none of the developers had ever taught in a real classroom. During her first advisory board meeting, Rose listened as developers proudly presented their latest educational software. The interface was beautiful, the graphics stunning, but Rose raised her hand. "May I ask a question?" she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Have you considered how this would work in a classroom where 3 students might have to share one device?" The room fell silent. The lead developer blinked in surprise. "We assumed each student would have their own tablet," he admitted. Rose smiled gently. "In many schools, that's not the reality. But that doesn't mean we can't create something amazing that works for everyone." She went on to share her experiences teaching in underfunded schools, where creativity and resourcefulness were as essential as any curriculum. Mr. Chen, sitting quietly at the back of the room, watched with satisfaction as Rose transformed from a nervous newcomer to a confident educator. Her practical insights and genuine concern for accessibility began to shift the entire department's approach. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Rose overheard one executive complaining in the break room. "We're a tech company, not a charity. These accessible versions will cut into our profits." The words stung, but they also strengthened her resolve. That evening, she stayed late at the office, working on a detailed proposal. She researched statistics about school funding disparities, interviewed teachers from her old district, and developed a model showing how making their software more accessible could actually expand their market in the long run. When she finally left the office that night, the security guard noticed her lights had been on well past dinner time. "Working late, Mrs. Rose?" he asked kindly. She nodded, clutching her research materials. "Just trying to make a difference," she replied. The next morning, she presented her findings to the board. Her hands trembled slightly as she began, but her voice was clear and passionate. "By designing our software to work on older devices and with limited resources, we're not just helping underfunded schools, we're creating a more robust, versatile product that can work anywhere." She shared stories from her teaching days, of students sharing textbooks, of creative workarounds for limited resources, of the incredible potential she saw in every child regardless of their economic background. "These kids don't need our pity," she concluded. "They need our commitment to giving them the same opportunities others have." The room was silent when she finished. Then Mr. Chen stood up and started applauding. Others joined in, and Rose felt tears threatening to form in her eyes. The same executive who had dismissed her ideas now approached her with respect in his eyes. "I hadn't thought about it that way," he admitted. "Would you be willing to work with my team to revise our distribution model?" Word of Rose's presentation spread through the company. Soon, other departments began consulting her about their projects, valuing her unique perspective that bridged the gap between corporate ambition and social responsibility. But success brought its own challenges. Some nights, Rose would wake up in her comfortable apartment, momentarily disoriented, the memory of street life still fresh in her mind. She never forgot the feeling of being invisible, of having people's eyes slide past her as if she didn't exist. This experience led her to start a weekly volunteer program at the company, encouraging employees to spend time at local homeless shelters and schools in underprivileged areas. "Understanding comes from experience," she would say. "We can't create solutions for people whose lives we don't understand." One day, about 3 months into her new role, Mr. Chen called her into his office. Rose entered, noticing how the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city skyline visible from his window. "Do you know why I really offered you this job?" he asked. Rose sat down, shaking her head slightly. "Anyone could have given me a granola bar that day," he continued. "But you did more than that. You showed wisdom, compassion, and dignity in circumstances that might have stripped those qualities from others. That's exactly what we needed here, someone who understands that true innovation isn't just about technology, it's about humanity." Rose left his office that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. As she walked through the city streets where she had once slept, she noticed a woman huddled in a doorway. Instead of walking past, she stopped. "Would you like to get some coffee?" she asked. "I'd love to hear your story." Because Rose understood better than most that every person had a story worth hearing, and that sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen to change a life forever. Her journey was far from over, but she was already proving that second chances, when given to the right person, could create ripples of change that touched countless lives. 6 months into her role at Chen Technologies, Rose's influence had begun to ripple outward in unexpected ways. The company's new educational software, designed with her guidance, was being piloted in 50 schools across the country, including many in low-income areas. But it was a chance encounter in the grocery store that would spark her next big initiative. She was selecting fresh vegetables when she overheard a young boy begging his mother to buy him a notebook for school. "I'm sorry, honey," the mother whispered, "but we need to get food first. Maybe next week." Rose watched as the boy's shoulders slumped, and suddenly she was transported back to her own classroom days, watching students struggle with basic supplies. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her journey from homelessness to having more than enough. Around 2 a.m., she opened her laptop and began typing. By morning, she had drafted a proposal that would change not just Chen Technologies, but the entire community. When she presented her idea to Mr. Chen the next day, her eyes were tired but bright with purpose. "We're doing great work with our educational software," she began, "but technology alone isn't enough. What if we created a foundation? One that combines educational support with community outreach?" Mr. Chen leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." Rose unveiled her vision. The Second Chance Foundation would provide educational resources to underprivileged schools while also offering job training and support services to homeless individuals. The foundation would partner with local businesses to create employment opportunities and work with schools to ensure students had the supplies they needed. "The thing about homelessness," Rose explained, her voice soft but passionate, "is that it's often not just about lacking a home. It's about losing your place in society, your sense of purpose. And education? It's not just about having a computer in the classroom. It's about having a pencil when you need one, about not being hungry during a test, about knowing someone believes in you." Mr. Chen studied the proposal carefully. "This is ambitious," he said finally. "It will require significant resources and commitment." Rose nodded. "I know. But think about it, what if that day you had your diabetic episode, I had already given up? What if I had lost my belief in helping others? Sometimes, all people need is a chance to show who they really are." 2 weeks later, the Second Chance Foundation was announced. The press release was modest, but the vision was bold. Rose insisted on keeping her own story relatively quiet. This wasn't about her, she maintained, but about creating opportunities for others. The foundation's first initiative was a complete education program. Working with local schools, they identified students in need and provided not just school supplies, but also food assistance, mentoring, and access to technology. But what made the program unique was its family approach. Parents were offered job training and placement services. One of their first participants was the mother and son from the grocery store. Rose had gone back the next day and left a gift card for school supplies with the store manager to give to them, along with information about the foundation. The mother, it turned out, had been an accountant in her home country but couldn't find work in the U.S. Through the foundation's program, she received certification courses and language support, eventually securing a position in Chen Technologies' finance department. The foundation's work soon caught the attention of other major companies. Rose found herself in meetings with corporate leaders who wanted to understand how they could implement similar programs. She never wore her expensive suits to these meetings, choosing instead to dress modestly. "I never want to forget where I came from," she explained to a curious colleague. "It helps me remember what's really important." But success brought scrutiny. A local news station ran a skeptical piece questioning whether a former homeless woman was qualified to run a multi-million-dollar foundation. The morning after it aired, Rose arrived at work to find her inbox flooded with emails, not of criticism, but of support. Teachers, students, and families who had benefited from the foundation's programs had written to share their stories. One email particularly touched her. It was from a high school student. "Before your program, I was embarrassed to go to school because I didn't have the right supplies. Now I'm not just going to school, I'm applying to colleges. My mom has a job now too. You didn't just help us with things, you gave us hope." Rose printed that email and hung it in her office. On difficult days, when the challenges seemed overwhelming, she would read it again. It reminded her of something she had learned during her months on the street, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could spark the biggest changes. The foundation's impact continued to grow. They developed a unique mentoring program where corporate employees volunteered their time to teach job skills to homeless individuals. Rose made sure that every volunteer went through sensitivity training first. "We're not here to save anyone," she would tell them. "We're here to provide opportunities and support. Everyone has dignity, everyone has potential." 1 year after the foundation's launch, they held a celebration dinner. But it wasn't a typical charity gala. Rose insisted on making it a community dinner where everyone ate together, from corporate executives to program participants. The dining room was filled with round tables, each one deliberately mixing people from different backgrounds. During the dinner, a small girl approached Rose's table. She was carrying a handmade card. "My mommy says you helped us when we needed it," she said shyly. "Now she has a job, and I have my own bed." Rose hugged the girl, fighting back tears. Later that evening, Mr. Chen raised his glass for a toast. "A year ago, someone showed me that success isn't just measured in profits, but in the lives we touch. She taught us that second chances aren't just about helping others, they're about building a stronger community for everyone." Rose looked around the room, seeing not a division between helpers and helped, but a community of people supporting each other. She thought about that morning on the street when she shared her last granola bar, never imagining where that simple act would lead. As the evening wound down, she stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The city lights sparkled against the dark sky, and she could hear laughter and conversation drifting from inside. A year ago, these same streets had been her home. Now they were a reminder of how far she had come, and how many others were still waiting for their chance. As the Second Chance Foundation entered its second year, Rose found herself facing an unexpected invitation. She was asked to testify before a state legislative committee about homelessness and education. The night before her testimony, she sat in her apartment, nervously reviewing her notes. The city lights twinkled outside her window, reminding her of countless nights spent on these same streets, invisible to the world. The next morning, as she entered the imposing state capitol building, she touched the worn photo in her pocket, a picture of her former kindergarten class, taken just months before she lost everything. It reminded her why she was here. This wasn't about her story anymore, it was about changing the system that had failed so many others. The hearing room was packed with politicians, reporters, and advocates. Rose took her seat at the testimony table, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. She didn't just share statistics or data, she shared stories. She told them about a brilliant high school student who did her homework by streetlight because her family lived in their car. About a former engineer who became homeless after a medical bankruptcy. About a single mother who kept her children in school while living in a shelter, determined to give them a better future. Homelessness isn't just about lacking a home, she explained, her voice steady and clear. It's about losing your place in society. But what we've learned through our foundation is that when we provide comprehensive support, education, job training, and community connection, people don't just survive, they thrive. The impact of her testimony was immediate. Local news stations ran special reports on the foundation's work. Other cities began reaching out, wanting to learn more about their model. But with this attention came new challenges. One morning, Rose arrived at work to find an email from a prominent business magazine wanting to do a feature story. They planned to title it, "From Homeless to Hero, the Fairy Tale Success Story." Rose immediately declined the interview. "This isn't a fairy tale," she wrote back. "It's about hard work, community support, and addressing systemic issues. And I'm not a hero, I'm just someone who got a second chance and wants to create the same opportunity for others." Instead of doing the magazine interview, Rose focused on expanding the foundation's reach. They launched a new initiative called Bridge the Gap, which partnered with local businesses to create job training programs specifically designed for homeless individuals. The program wasn't just about teaching skills, it was about rebuilding confidence and connection. One of their first participants was a former art teacher who had been living in her car for 8 months. Through the program, she not only found stable housing and employment but also started teaching art classes at local shelters. "Art helps people remember who they are," she explained during a foundation event. "When you're homeless, you lose your identity. Creating something beautiful helps you find it again." The foundation's education initiatives were also growing. They developed a groundbreaking program that provided not just school supplies and technology, but also mental health support and family advocacy. Rose insisted that every school they worked with had a dedicated family support coordinator who understood both education and social services. But perhaps their most innovative program came from an unexpected source. During a routine meeting, one of the foundation's teenage participants mentioned how embarrassing it was to not have a place to do laundry. This sparked an idea. Within months, the foundation launched Clean Start, a mobile laundry service that visited schools in low-income areas, allowing students to wash their clothes for free while providing a space for homework help and mentoring. The program quickly became about more than just clean clothes. It became a community hub where students could get tutoring, parents could access resources, and families could maintain their dignity. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference, Rose often said. Having clean clothes might seem simple, but it can mean the difference between a child going to school or staying home. As the foundation's work expanded, Rose never lost sight of its core mission. She still spent time at local shelters, sitting with people, listening to their stories. One cold evening, she met an elderly woman who reminded her of her mother. The woman had worked as a nurse for 30 years before a series of strokes left her unable to work. With no family and limited savings, she ended up on the streets. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about how many others were out there, people who had worked hard all their lives but still ended up homeless. The next morning, she called an emergency meeting with her team. "We need to think bigger," she announced. "It's not enough to help people after they become homeless. We need to work on prevention." This led to the creation of the Safety Net program, which provided emergency assistance to people at risk of losing their homes. The program offered short-term financial help, but more importantly, it connected people with resources before they reached crisis point. The program proved so successful that several other cities began implementing similar models. Rose found herself traveling more, speaking at conferences and meeting with community leaders who wanted to replicate their work. But she always made sure to maintain the personal connection that had made the foundation successful. During one such trip, she visited a shelter in another city. As she sat talking with the residents, a young woman approached her. "I saw you on TV," she said quietly. "They said you used to be homeless too. I want to know if it gets better." Rose took the woman's hand. "It does get better," she said. "But not just because of luck or magic. It gets better when we support each other, when we remember that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life." That conversation led to another new initiative, a peer support program where people who had experienced homelessness became mentors for others going through similar situations. "Who better to guide someone through this journey," Rose explained to her board, "than someone who has walked the same path." As the foundation approached its second anniversary, Rose received news that would take their work to an even larger scale. A major national foundation had noticed their success and wanted to help replicate their model across the country. But they had one condition: Rose would need to step into an even more public role as an advocate for systemic change. The opportunity to take the Second Chance Foundation National came with both excitement and apprehension. Rose spent a sleepless night in her apartment, thinking about what it would mean. The foundation had succeeded locally because of its personal touch. Every person who came through their doors was treated as an individual, not a statistic. Could they maintain that approach on a national scale? The answer came from an unexpected source. During her regular volunteer shift at the local shelter, Rose met a young mother who had fled domestic violence with her 2 children. As they talked over cups of coffee, the woman shared how she had tried to get help in 3 different cities before finding support here. Each place had resources, the woman explained, clutching her coffee cup. But they were all scattered. Nobody looked at the whole picture. "Here, you didn't just help us find a place to stay, you helped us rebuild our lives." That conversation crystallized Rose's vision for national expansion. They wouldn't just replicate their programs, they would create a network of community-based support centers, each adapted to local needs but connected by a common philosophy of comprehensive care and personal dignity. The first step was creating a training program for other cities. Rose insisted that every center should be staffed by people who understood local challenges, including those who had experienced homelessness themselves. "We're not here to tell communities what they need," she explained during a planning meeting. "We're here to help them build on what they already know works." The National Foundation was initially skeptical of this approach. They preferred standardized programs that could be easily measured and replicated. But Rose stood firm. During a crucial meeting with their board, she shared a story that changed their perspective. "In our first year," she began, "we had a participant who was a former chef. Most programs would have pushed him toward any available job. But we took the time to understand his skills and passion. Today, he not only runs a successful catering business, but he also teaches cooking classes at our centers, helping others build their own careers. That's what happens when you see people as individuals, not problems to solve." The board was convinced, and the national rollout began. Rose traveled extensively, but she made sure to maintain her connection to the original center. She still volunteered at the shelter once a week, saying it kept her grounded in the reality of their mission. One of their first national initiatives was the Community Kitchen program, inspired by that former chef. Each center included a commercial kitchen where participants could receive culinary training, start catering businesses, or simply cook meals for their families. These kitchens became more than just training facilities, they became gathering places where people could share stories, skills, and hope. The program's success caught the attention of celebrity chefs and restaurant owners. Soon, they had partnerships with restaurants across the country, providing apprenticeships and job opportunities. But Rose made sure these partnerships went beyond just employment. "We're not looking for charity," she told a group of restaurant owners. "We're looking for real opportunities for people to rebuild their careers and their lives." She shared how their first chef participant now employed other program graduates in his catering business, creating a cycle of opportunity and support. As the foundation expanded, they faced new challenges. Some communities were resistant to their programs, fearing they would attract more homeless people to their areas. Rose addressed these concerns head-on, speaking at town halls and community meetings. During one particularly tense meeting, a resident angrily demanded to know why his tax dollars should help people who don't help themselves. Rose listened patiently, then shared her own story, not of her success, but of the countless small humiliations she had faced while homeless. "I once stood in line for 3 hours at a government office," she recalled, only to be told I couldn't get an ID because I had no permanent address. "Without ID, I couldn't apply for jobs. Without a job, I couldn't afford housing. These are the cycles we're trying to break." Her honesty and vulnerability often transformed skeptics into supporters. One by one, communities began to see the value of their comprehensive approach. The Foundation's data showed that participants who received coordinated support, housing, job training, education, and healthcare, were far more likely to achieve lasting stability. But Rose never let the growing success make her forget the human side of their work. She insisted that every center maintain a dignity fund, money set aside for small but important needs that other programs might overlook. This could mean a new suit for a job interview, a birthday cake for a child, or simply a pair of comfortable shoes. "When you're homeless," she often explained, "you lose more than your home. You lose the small dignities that most people take for granted. Restoring those dignities is just as important as providing shelter." The Foundation's work began to influence policy discussions at the national level. Rose was invited to participate in congressional hearings and policy forums. But she always insisted on bringing program participants with her to share their stories directly. During one such hearing, a soft-spoken woman described how the Foundation had helped her family after a medical crisis left them homeless. "They didn't just give us a place to stay," she testified. They helped us navigate the healthcare system, kept my children in their school, and helped me retrain for a new career. They treated us like people who had hit a rough patch, not like failures. As the foundation approached its third year, they had centers in 20 cities, with plans for 30 more. Each center was unique, adapted to local needs and resources, but all shared the same core principle: treating people with dignity and providing comprehensive support. Rose's schedule became increasingly demanding, but she never lost her personal touch. She still carried the same worn backpack she had used on the streets, now filled with foundation documents instead of survival supplies. It reminded her of where she came from and why their work mattered. One evening, after a long day of meetings in a new city, Rose took a walk through the local neighborhood. She passed a woman sitting on a bench, obviously homeless, trying to stay warm. Instead of just walking by, Rose sat down beside her. "Would you like to get some coffee?" she asked, just as she had done countless times before. "I'd love to hear your story." Because Rose knew that every story mattered, and every person deserved to be heard. The Foundation's national expansion wasn't just about creating more programs, it was about building a network of hope, one conversation, one person, one community at a time. For years after that fateful morning when she shared her last granola bar with Mr. Chen, Rose found herself standing in front of the United Nations, preparing to address an international conference on poverty and education. As she waited to speak, she thought about how far she had come, and how much further there was still to go. The Second Chance Foundation now operated in 50 cities across the country, but its impact went far beyond numbers. They had sparked a fundamental shift in how communities approached homelessness and poverty. Their comprehensive model had proven that when people received coordinated support, addressing not just immediate needs but long-term stability, they could rebuild their lives permanently. Yet Rose never forgot that behind every success story was a person who had struggled, hoped, and persevered. Earlier that morning, before heading to the UN, she had visited one of their New York centers. There, she met a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren while living in a shelter. The woman had been a library assistant for 20 years before budget cuts left her unemployed. "I never thought this could happen to me," the woman had confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did everything right, worked hard, saved what I could. But one bad break, and here we are." Rose carried that conversation with her as she stepped up to the podium. Looking out at the assembled diplomats and world leaders, she set aside her prepared speech and spoke from her heart. "We often talk about homelessness in terms of statistics," she began. "But behind every number is a story. A teacher who lost everything caring for a sick parent. A veteran struggling to readjust to civilian life. A child doing homework by candlelight in a shelter. These aren't just statistics, they're our neighbors, our former colleagues, our children's classmates." She shared how the Foundation's approach had evolved, guided by the experiences and wisdom of those they served. Their latest initiative, called Community Circles, created networks of support that extended beyond immediate crisis intervention. The program had started when they noticed that many former participants wanted to stay connected to the Foundation even after they had achieved stability. Instead of seeing this as dependency, Rose recognized it as an opportunity. These graduates became mentors, volunteers, and eventually staff members, creating a continuous circle of support and understanding. True change, she explained to the international audience, doesn't come from top-down solutions. It comes from building communities where everyone has value, where dignity is a right, not a privilege, and where second chances are seen as investments in our shared future. The impact of her speech was immediate. Representatives from several countries approached her about implementing similar programs in their nations. But Rose was careful about expansion. "Our model works because it's built on understanding local communities," she explained. "We can share our principles, but each community needs to shape its own solutions." Back in the States, the Foundation faced a new challenge. The success of their programs had attracted attention from large corporations wanting to partner with them. While the potential resources were tempting, Rose was concerned about maintaining their integrity. During a crucial board meeting, a major corporation offered significant funding in exchange for naming rights to their centers. The amount would have allowed them to open dozens of new locations. The board was divided, with some arguing that the ends justified the means. Rose listened to all sides before speaking. "When I was homeless," she said quietly, "the hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was feeling like I had lost my identity, become just another faceless problem to be solved. Our centers work because people feel seen and respected when they walk through our doors. We can't compromise that." Instead of accepting corporate naming rights, they launched a unique fundraising campaign called 1,000 Stories. They invited program participants, past and present, to share their experiences through various media, writing, art, music, or video. These stories were displayed in public spaces, challenging stereotypes and building understanding. The campaign revealed the extraordinary diversity of people affected by homelessness. There was the former tech worker who lost everything in a market crash, the young artist who fled domestic violence, the retired teacher whose medical bills depleted her savings. Each story highlighted both the fragility of financial security and the resilience of the human spirit. One story particularly resonated with the public. A 12-year-old girl had created a simple video diary of her family's journey from homelessness to stability through the Foundation's program. She filmed their move into their new apartment, her first day back at her old school, and her mother's graduation from a job training program. Her final entry showed her sleeping in her own bed, something she hadn't done in 8 months. The campaign raised more money than any corporate sponsorship would have provided, but more importantly, it changed public perception. People began to see homelessness not as a personal failure, but as a community challenge requiring community solutions. This shift in perspective led to concrete policy changes. Cities began adopting the Foundation's comprehensive support model as part of their official response to homelessness. School districts implemented early intervention programs to support students and families at risk of housing instability. Hospitals started working with the Foundation to prevent medical bankruptcies from leading to homelessness. Rose's own role had evolved as well. While she remained deeply involved in the Foundation's work, she had learned to delegate day-to-day operations to a talented team, many of whom had come through their programs. This allowed her to focus on advocacy and innovation, always looking for new ways to break the cycles of poverty and homelessness. One morning, as she walked through the original center where it all began, she passed the wall of success stories, photographs and letters from people who had rebuilt their lives through the Foundation. A new addition caught her eye. It was a letter from a young woman who had been in their first group of participants. "4 years ago, I was sleeping in my car with my 2 kids," the letter read. "Today, I own a small business, my children are thriving in school, and I volunteer at the center every week. But the biggest change isn't in our circumstances, it's in how we see ourselves. The Foundation didn't just give us help, they gave us back our dignity, our hope, and our belief in ourselves." Rose touched the letter gently, remembering her own journey. She thought about that morning when she shared her last granola bar with Mr. Chen, never imagining where that simple act of kindness would lead. Sometimes the smallest actions could spark the biggest changes, not just in one life, but in an entire community. As she headed to her next meeting, she passed a new participant entering the center, looking nervous and uncertain. Rose stopped and introduced herself, not as the Foundation's founder or an international speaker, but simply as someone who understood. Because she knew that real change began with these moments, one person reaching out to another, sharing not just resources, but hope. 5 years had passed since that winter morning when Rose shared her last granola bar with a stranger. As she stood at the window of her office at the Second Chance Foundation's headquarters, watching the early morning light paint the city skyline, she reflected on how much had changed, and how much remained the same. The Foundation now operated in over 70 cities, had helped more than 100,000 people find stability, and had transformed the national conversation about homelessness. But for Rose, success wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in moments, in lives touched, in hope restored. That morning, she had a special meeting scheduled. The foundation was launching its most ambitious initiative yet, the Full Circle program. The idea had come from an unexpected source, Mr. Chen himself, who still served on the board and remained one of their strongest supporters. "Remember how it all started?" he had asked during a recent board meeting. "With one person helping another? What if we could create that same ripple effect, but on a larger scale?" The Full Circle program would create a network of support centers in every major city, each offering not just immediate assistance but long-term community building. The centers would be staffed primarily by program graduates, creating employment opportunities while ensuring that help came from people who truly understood the journey. As Rose prepared for the launch event, her assistant brought in a stack of letters. They still received hundreds each week, stories of lives changed, thanks expressed, hope renewed. But one envelope caught her eye. It was addressed in familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter from one of their first participants, a woman who had come to them 4 years ago with her 3 children. Rose remembered her clearly. She had been a teacher before a series of personal tragedies left her family homeless. Now, she wrote to share that not only had she rebuilt her life, but she had just been appointed principal of an elementary school. "You taught me that rock bottom can be a foundation to build upon," the letter read. "Now I make sure every child in my school knows that their circumstances don't define their worth." The letter reminded Rose of something important. As she headed to the conference room for the launch meeting, she made a brief detour to the center's kitchen. There, in a frame on the wall, was the wrapper from that last granola bar she had shared with Mr. Chen. He had kept it all these years, and when they opened the first center, he had insisted on displaying it. "To remind us," he had said, "that the biggest changes often start with the smallest acts of kindness." The launch meeting wasn't being held in some fancy hotel or corporate boardroom. Instead, Rose had insisted on hosting it at their original center, in the community room where so many lives had begun to change. The room was filled with an unusual mix of people. Corporate leaders sat next to program graduates, politicians next to shelter residents, all united by a common purpose. As Rose stood to speak, she noticed a young woman slipping quietly into the back of the room. She recognized her from the shelter. She had just arrived last week, a former nurse who had lost everything caring for her sick mother. The woman's presence reminded Rose why they were all here. 5 years ago, Rose began, I was homeless, invisible to most of the world. Today, I stand before you not as a success story, but as proof that when we give people the support they need, anything is possible. But more importantly, I stand here as part of a community that believes in second chances. She explained how the Full Circle program would work. Each center would offer immediate assistance, shelter, food, medical care, but that was just the beginning. They would provide job training, education support, mental health services, and something equally important, a sense of belonging. When you're homeless, Rose explained, you lose more than your home. You lose your place in the world. Our centers aren't just about providing services, they're about rebuilding community. The program would include some innovative features. Each center would have a skills exchange, where participants could share their expertise with others. Former teachers could offer tutoring, retired craftspeople could teach trade skills, and everyone would have something to contribute. We're not just helping people get back on their feet, Rose continued. We're helping them remember who they are, what they can offer, and how much they matter. The presentation was interrupted by a commotion at the door. A group of people was arriving, program graduates from across the country who had flown in to surprise Rose. Among them was the chef who had started their culinary training program, the artist who had inspired their creative therapy workshops, and dozens of others whose lives had been transformed through the foundation. One by one, they stood to share their stories. But they weren't just stories of personal success, they were stories of giving back, of helping others, of continuing the circle of support that had helped them. The young woman at the back of the room listened intently, hope beginning to replace the despair in her eyes. After the meeting, Rose made her way through the crowd to speak with her. 5 years ago, Rose told her, someone saw me when I felt invisible. They gave me a chance when I thought all chances were gone. Now it's our turn to do the same for others. As the day drew to a close, Rose returned to her office. On her desk was a small package from Mr. Chen. Inside was a box of granola bars and a note, for the next person who needs one. Rose smiled, remembering that cold morning 5 years ago. She had thought she was sharing her last possession, but instead, she had started something that would change countless lives. That evening, as she volunteered at the shelter as she still did every week, Rose shared those granola bars with new arrivals. Each one came with a message: you matter. You belong. And this is just the beginning. Because Rose understood that while the foundation had grown beyond anything she could have imagined, its heart remained the same, one person reaching out to another, sharing hope, offering dignity, and believing in second chances. As she walked home under the city lights, Rose thought about how far they had come and how far they still had to go. But she wasn't worried. Because now she knew that change didn't require grand gestures or perfect solutions. Sometimes it just took one person willing to share what they had, to see the humanity in others, and to believe that every person deserved a chance to rebuild their life. And somewhere in the city, someone who had received one of those granola bars was already planning how they would help the next person they met, continuing the circle of kindness that had started on a cold morning 5 years ago with one simple act of human connection.